Hi there. Hello. I'm going to be reading today from The Nature of the Psyche by Jane Roberts, a Seth book. And I came upon this the other day and I was excited because it was session 776, 777, and 778. And these were recorded in May of 1976. When I was 18, I took off to California in June of 1976. So this was a real surprise to read. Anyway, this first part is called, the chapter is called The Language of Love. Session 776, May 17, 1976 at 9:14 p.m. Monday. Good evening. Dictation. There are channels of interrelatedness connecting all physical matter, channels through which consciousness flows. In those terms of which I am speaking, man's identification with nature allowed him to utilize those inner channels. He could send his own consciousness swimming, so to speak, through many currents in which other kinds of consciousness merged. I said that the language of love was the one basic language, and I mean that quite literally. Man loved nature, identified with its many parts, and added to his own sense of being by joining into its power and identifying with its force. It is not so much that he personified the elements of nature as that he threw his personality into its elements and rode them, so to speak. As mentioned, love incites the desire to know, explore, and communicate with the beloved. So language began as man tried to express his love for the natural world. Initially, language had nothing to do with words, and indeed verbal language emerged only when man had lost a portion of his love, forgotten some of his identification with nature, so that he no longer understood his voice to be his also. In those early days, man possessed a gargantuan arena for the expression of his emotions. He did not symbolically rage with the storms, for example, but quite consciously identified with them to such a degree that he and his tribesmen merged with the wind and the lightning, and became part of the storm's forces. They felt and knew as well that the storm would refresh the land, whatever their fury. Because of such identification with nature, the death experience, as you understand it, was in no way considered an end. The mobility of consciousness was a fact of experience. The self was not considered to be stuck within the skin. The body was considered more or less like a friendly home or cave, kindly giving the self refuge, but not confining it. The language of love did not initially involve images either. Images in the mind, as they are understood, emerged in their present form only when man had again lost a portion of his love and identification and forgotten how to identify with an image from its insides, and so began to view it from outside. I would like to emphasize the difficulty of explaining such a language verbally. In a way, the language of love followed molecular roots, a sort of biological alphabet, though alphabet is far too limiting a term. Each natural element had its own key system that interlocked with others, forming channels through which consciousness would flow from one kind of life to another. Man understood himself to be a separate entity, but one that was connected to all of nature. The emotional reaches of his subjective life then leapt far beyond what you think of as private experience. Each person participating fully in a storm, for example, still participated in his or her own individual way, yet the grandeur of the emotions that allowed full sway, and the seasons of the earth and world were jointly felt. The language or the method of communication can best be described perhaps as direct cognition. Direct cognition is dependent upon the lover's kind of identification, where what is known is known. At that stage no words or even images were needed. The wind outside and the breath were felt to be one and the same, so that the wind and the earth breathing out the breath that rose from the mouths of the living, spreading out through the earth's body. Part of man went out with the breath. Therefore man's consciousness could go wherever the wind traveled, and man's consciousness traveling with the wind became part of all places. A person's identity was private in that man always knew who he was. He was so sure of his identity that he did not feel the need to protect it, so that he could expand his awareness in a way now quite foreign to you. Give us a moment. Take the English sentence. I observed the tree. If that original language had words, to be the equivalent would be that as a tree I observed myself. Or taking on my tree nature I rest in my shade. Or even from my man nature I rest in the shade of my tree nature. Man did not so much stand on the shore looking down at the water as he immersed his consciousness within it. Man's initial curiosity did not involve seeing, feeling, or touching the object's nature as much as it involved a joyful psychic exploration in which he plunged his consciousness rather than, say, his foot into the stream, though he did both. If that language I speak of had been verbal, man would never have said, "The water flows through the valley." Instead, the sentence would have read something like this: "Running over the rocks, my water self flows together with others in slippery union." That translation is not the best either. Man did not designate his own as the only kind of consciousness by any means. He graciously thanked the tree that gave him shade, for example, and he understood the tree retained its own identity, even when it allowed his awareness to join with it. In your terms, the use of language began as man lost this kind of identification, and I must stress again that the identification was not symbolic, but practical, daily expression. Nature spoke for man and man for nature. In a manner of speaking, the noun and the verb were one. The noun did not disappear, but expressed itself as the verb. In a kind of emotional magnification unknown to you, each person's private emotions were given expression and released through nature's change, a release that was understood and then taken for granted. The most profound of terms, weather conditions and emotions, were still highly related. The inner conditions cause the exterior climactic change, though of course it now seems to you that it is the other way around. You are robbed then, or you rob yourselves, of one of the most basic kinds of expression, since you can no longer identify yourselves with the forces of nature. Man wanted to pursue a certain kind of consciousness, however. In your terms, over a period of time, he pulled his awareness in, so to speak. He no longer identified as he did before, and he began to view objects through the object of his own body. He no longer merged his awareness so that he learned to look at a tree as one object, and before he would have joined with it, perhaps viewed his own standing body from the tree's vantage point. It was then that the mental image became important in usual terms, for he had understood these before, but in a different way, from the inside out. Now, as he began to draw and sketch and to learn how to build images in the mind that were connected to the real exterior objects in the present accepted manner, now he walked, not simply for pleasure, but to gain the information he wanted, to cross distances that before his consciousness had freely traveled. So he needed primitive maps and signs, and instead of using images, he used partial ones, fragments of circles or lines, to represent natural objects. He always made the sounds that communicated emotions, intent, and sheer exuberance. When he became involved with sketched or drawn images, he began to imitate their form with the shape of his lips. The O was perfect and represents one of his initial deliberate sounds of verbalized language. Take your break. Now, regardless of the language you speak, the sound that you can make are dependent upon your physical structure, so that human language is composed of certain limited numbers of sounds. Your physical construction is a result of intermolecular configurations, and the sounds you make are related to those. I said before that early man felt a certain emotional magnification, that he felt, for example, the wind's voice as his own. In a manner of speaking, your languages, while expressing your individual intents and communications, also represent a kind of amplification arising from your molecular configuration. The wind makes certain sounds that are dependent upon the characteristics of the earth. The breath makes certain sounds that are dependent on the characteristics of the body. There is a connection between alphabets and molecular structures that compose your tissue. Alphabets then are natural keys also. Such natural keys have a molecular history. You form these keys into certain sound patterns that have particular meaning. This provides you with certain kinds of communication, but also allows a certain expression that is natural and at that level, and then used by you for your own purposes. I am not saying that molecules speak. I am saying that they are expressed through your speech, however, and that your speech represents an amplification of their existence. Through your words, their reality is amplified in the same way that man's emotions once found amplification through the physical elements. Certain sounds are verbal replicas of molecular constructions put together by you to form sentences in the same way. For example, that molecules are put together to form cells in tissue. There are inner sounds that act like layers between tissues that coat molecules and serve as a basis for exterior sound principles. These are also connected to the rhythms of the body itself. To some extent, punctuation is sound that you do not hear, a pause that implies the presence of a withheld sound. To some extent, then, language is as dependent upon unspoken as the spoken, and the rhythm of silence as well as of sound. In that context, however, silence involves merely a pause of sound in which sound is implied but withheld. Inner sound deals with primarily that kind of relationship. Language is meaningful only because the rhythm of silence upon which it rides. Its meaning comes from the pauses between the sounds as much as it does from the sounds themselves. The flow of breath is obviously important, regulating the rhythm and the spacing of the words. The breath's integrity arises directly from the proper give and take between cells and functioning of the tissues and all that is the expression of the molecular competence. That competence is obviously responsible for language, but beyond that it is intimately connected with the patterns of language themselves and the construction of syntax, and even the figures of speech used. Again, you speak for yourselves, yet in doing so you speak a language that is not yours alone, but the result of inner communication too swift for you to follow, involving corporal and subjective realities alike. For this reason, your language have meaning on several levels. The sounds you make have physical effects on your own and other bodies. There is a sound value, then is apart from a meaning value. The words you speak to someone else are as certain terms broken down by the listener to basic components and understood at different levels. They are psychological interpretations made and molecular ones. The sounds and their pauses will express emotional stages, and reactions to these will alter the body's condition to whatever degree. The listener then breaks down the language and he builds up his own response. You have connected words and images. That language seems to consist of sound that suggests an image, yet some languages have sounds for feelings and subjective states, and they have no subjects or predicates, nor even a sentence structure that you would recognize. Your language must follow your perception, though the sound structure beneath need not. You say, I am today, I was yesterday, and I will be tomorrow. Yet some languages would find such utterances incomprehensible, and the words I am would be used in all instances. Take your break or end the session as you prefer. Okay. Well, I'll start this. This is session 777, May 24th, 1976 at 9:45 p.m. Monday. Now, good evening. Dictation. Initially, however, before the birth of images and words as you understand them, the world existed in different terms from those you know. Images as you consider them had not taken the form that you recognize. It seems that to you that visually, for example, the natural world must be put together or perceived in a certain fashion. Whatever your language, you perceive trees, mountains, peoples, oceans. You never see a man merge with a tree, for example. This would be considered an hallucinatory image. Your visual data are learned and interpreted so that they appear as the only possible results of those data. Inner vision can confound you because in your mind you often see images quite clearly that you would dismiss if your eyes were open. In terms of which we are speaking, however, the young species utilize what I have called the inner senses to a far greater degree than you do. Visually, early man did not perceive the physical world in a way that seems natural to you. I will have to give us time. When a man's consciousness, for example, blended with that of a tree, those data became visible for others to perceive, and when a man's consciousness merged with an animal's, that blending became visual also. In a manner of speaking, the brain put visual information together so that the visual contents of the world were not as stationary as they are now. You have learned to be highly specific in your physical sight and interpretations, and your mental visions hold hints as to data that could be, but are not physically perceived. You have trained yourself to react to certain visual cues which trigger your mental interpretations and to ignore other variations. These latter can be described as too subtle, yet actually they are more subtle than those cues you acknowledge. Data, you say, are stored in the chromosomes, strung together in certain fashion. Now biologically that is direct cognition. The inner senses perceive directly in the same fashion. To you, language means words, and words are always symbols for emotions, feelings, intents, or desires. Direct cognition did not need the symbols. The first language, the initial language, did not involve images or words, but dealt with a free flow of directly cognitive material. A man wondering what a tree was like became one, and let his own consciousness flow into the tree. Man's consciousness mixed and merged with other kinds of consciousness with a great curiosity of love. A child did not simply look at an animal, but let its consciousness merge with the animal's. And so to some extent the animal looked as though to some extent the animal looked out through the child's eyes. In ways most difficult to explain, man absorbed an animal spirit before he killed it, so that the spirit of the animal merged with his own, and in using the animal's flesh, then the hunter believed that he was giving the animal a new focus of existence. He could draw on the animal's strength, and the animal could join in human consciousness. Nature and spirit therefore were one. Your own kind of focus emerged from such a background, so that within yourselves you contain certain myriad consciousness of that which you are unaware. Through your own particular focus, the consciousness of the natural world merged to form a synthesis in which, for example, symphonies can emerge. You act not for yourselves, but also for other kinds of consciousness that you have purposefully forgotten. In following your own purposes, which are yours, you also serve the purposes of others you have forgotten. In thinking your own private thoughts, you also add to a larger psychic and mental reality of which you are part. Your languages program your perceptions and limit your communications in certain terms as much as they facilitate it. A musician writing a symphony, however, does not use all of the notes that are available to him. He chooses and discriminates, and his discrimination is based upon his knowledge of information available. However, in the same way, your languages are based upon the inner knowledge of a large available communication. The secrets of language are not to be found, then, in the available sounds, accents, roots, words are syllables, but in the rhythms between the words and the pauses and hesitations, the flow in which the words are put together and the unsaid inferences that are correct in verbal visual data. As a species, you sought certain kinds of experience. Individually, as your tribes or nations, you follow certain progressions, and yet in doing so you act also on that part of the whole of nature. You take into your bodies in transmuted form the consciousness of all of the things you consume. These consciousnesses then emerge to perceive the world in a fashion you call your own. Through your eyes, the beasts, the vegetables, the birds, the dust perceive the dawn and the sunlight as you do, and yet on the other hand, your own experience is your own. To some extent, it is true to say that language emerged as you began to lose direct communication with your own experience and with that of others. Language is therefore a substitute for direct communication. The symbols of the words stand for your own and someone else's experience while protecting you or them from it at the same time. Visual data you perceive the same amount of visual language, and the images perceived are like visual words. An object is presented to your visual perception so that you can safely perceive it from the outside. Objects as you see them are symbols. Take your break. Now, Rupert's sense of strangeness is indeed connected with this evening's material. He was, however, briefly involved in a process that enabled him to reach beneath verbal or imagery language. In a manner of speaking, he approached other thresholds of perception, and with my help translate those data into material given. He felt as if he had been on a long journey, and he was, though it was not a conscious one in terms you recognize. The training that connects your visual verbal culture prevents full translation, but Rupert was putting together with my help information available, and there are gaps in your awareness that are actually filled with data, and Rupert is letting these pool up, so to speak. He will become more proficient for that reason, and I will now end the session. He feels as if his consciousness was stretched out of shape in a certain way, as muscles might be if he used them in a new manner. Let him rest, and as he becomes aware of the distances in his own consciousness, in a fashion difficult to describe neurologically, he became familiar to some extent with the stuff beneath language, the inner rhythms unexpressed, and felt an odd connection that exists between words and your sense of time. This confused him, for this was material directly felt but verbally inexpressible. He will readjust in no time. End of session. And then I'll read the last session, 779, June 14th, 1976. This is in Chapter 7, The Psyche, Languages, and Gods. Good evening. Dictation. While Rupert continues his recovery, we will begin the next chapter entitled The Psyche, Languages, and Gods, with a small g. Almost any question that you can ask about God with a capital can be legitimately asked of the psyche as well. It seems to you that you know yourself, but that you take the existence of your own psyche on faith. At best, it often seems that you are all that you know of your psyche, and you will complain that you do not know yourself to begin with. And when you say, I want to find myself, you usually take it for granted that there is a completed, done, finished version of yourself that you must have mislaid somewhere. And when you think of finding God, you often think in the same terms. Now, you are around yourself all the time. You are ever becoming yourself. In a manner of speaking, you are composed of those patterns of yourself that are everywhere coming together. You cannot help but be yourself. Biologically, mentally, spiritually, you are marked as apart from all others, and no cloak of conventionality can ever hide that unalterable uniqueness. You cannot help but be yourself then. In a way, physically, you are a molecular language that communicates to others, but a language with its own peculiarities. As if speaking an accepted tongue, you spoke with a biological accent that carried its own flavor and meaning. When you ask, what is my psyche, or my soul, or who am I, you are seeking, of course, for your own meaning, as apart from what you already know about yourself. In that context, God is known, and as unknown, you are to yourself. Both God and the psyche are constantly expanding, unalterable, and always becoming. You will question, most likely, becoming what? For to you, it usually seems that all motions tend toward a state of completion of one kind or another. You think, therefore, in terms of becoming perfect, or becoming free. The word becoming by itself seems to leave you up in the air, so to speak, suspended without definitions. If I say you are becoming what you already are, then my remark sounds meaningless, for if you already are, how can you become what already is accomplished? In larger terms, however, what you are is always vaster than your knowledge of yourself, and for in a physical life you cannot keep up with your own psychological and psychic activity. Again, in a way, your body speaks a biological language, but in terms of you are bilingual, to say the least. You deal with certain kinds of organizations. They can be equated with biological adjectives and nouns, and the results in certain time sequences that can be compared to sentences and read and written from one side to say the other. Pretend that your life experience is a page of a book, and that you read an experience from top to bottom, left to right, sentence by sentence, paragraph by paragraph, but it is you that you know, the worldview that you understand, but other quite as legitimate yous may read and experience the same page backwards, or read each other letter downward or back up again, as you would a column of figures. Or others might mix and match the letters in entirely different fashions altogether, forming entirely different sentences. Still other vaster you might be aware of all the different methods of experiencing that particular page, which is your life as you understand it. You think that your own consciousness is the only logical culmination of your body's reality. You read yourself in a certain accepted fashion. In the entire book of life, however, just physically speaking, there are interrelationships on adjacent levels that you do not perceive, as other portions of your biological consciousness or biological language relate to the entire fabric of the world. In physical terms, you are alive because of the substructures, psychic, spiritual, and biological, of which you hardly have any comprehension at all. These are implied, however, in the nature of your own consciousness, which could not exist otherwise as you know it, as a language gains and attains its meanings not only by what is included in it, but also by what is excluded. So your consciousness attains its stability by its own exclusions. When what you are is amplified in the nature of what you are not. By the same token, you are what you are because of the existence of what you are not. You read yourself from top of this page to the bottom, and from what you think of as the beginning to the end. Your greater reality, however, is read in terms of intensities, so that the psyche puts you together in different ways. The psyche does not mark time. To it, the intense experience of your life exists simultaneously, and in your terms, they would be the psyche's presence. The psyche deals with probable events, however, to some events. Perhaps those that you dreamed of but did not materialize are quite real to the psyche. They are far more real to it than most innocuous but definite physical events, for example, yesterday's morning breakfast. The inner events of the psyche compose a greater experience from which the physical events arise. They can cast an aura that almost magically makes your life your own. Even if two people encounter precisely the same event in their lives at precisely the same time, their experiences of reality would still hardly be approximately connected. Take your break. Again, you read your own identities in particular specialized fashion within your biological experience. However, plant, mineral, animal, and human consciousness interact. They encounter each other. In the language of the self that you speak, these encounters are like the implied pauses in your verbal language. Together, these other kinds of consciousness then form inner rhythms upon which you superimpose your own. These encounters of consciousness go on constantly. They form their own kind of adjacent identities. You would call them some species of consciousness, perhaps, but they are really identities that operate in a trans-species fashion. If you read yourself sideways in such a manner, you would discover the portion of your own consciousness stretching out across the entire fabric of the earth as you understand it, becoming a part of the earth's material, even as those materials become part of the self as you recognize. Your consciousness would be far less hemmed in. Time would expand adjacently. You would think of yourselves physically as top dogs, however separate from the other species and kinds of life, so that in effect you limit your own experience of your psyche. If you thought or felt in such a fashion, then you would appreciate the fact biologically your body is yours by virtue of the mineral, plant, and animal life from which it gains its sustenance. You would not feel imprisoned, as you often do, within one corporeal form, for you would understand the body itself maintains its relative stability because of its constant give and take with the materials of the earth that are themselves possessed of consciousness. You could, to some extent, feel your own body coming together and dispersing constantly, and understand how you hover within it without fearing your own annihilation upon its dismantlement. When you ask, "Who am I?" you are trying to read yourself as if you were a simple sentence already written. Instead, you write yourself as you go along. The sentence that you recognize is only one of many probable variations. You and no other choose what experiences you want to actualize. You do this as spontaneously as you speak words. You take it for granted that a separate being will be you take it for granted that a sentence begun will be finished. You are in the midst of speaking yourself. The speaking, which is your life, seems to happen by itself. Since you are not aware of keeping yourself alive, your heart beats whether or not you understand anatomy. Give us a moment. You read yourself in too narrow terms. Much of the pain connected with serious illness and death results because you have no faith in your own continuing reality. You fight pain because you have not learned to transcend it, or rather use it. You do not trust the natural consequences of the body, so that when its end nears, and such an end is inevitable, you do not trust the signals the body gives that are meant to free you. Certain kinds of pain automatically eject consciousness from the body. Such pain cannot be verbalized, for it is a mixture of pain and pleasure, a tearing free, and it automatically brings about an almost exhilarating release of consciousness. Such pain is also very brief. Under your present system, however, drugs are usually administered, in which pain can cause pains in somewhat minimized Under your present system, however, drugs are usually administered in which cause pain is somewhat minimized but prolonged, not triggering the natural release mechanism. If you read yourselves adjacently, you would build up confidence in the body and in those cooperative consciousnesses that form it. You would have an intimate awareness of the body's healing process also, and you would not fear death as annihilation, and you would feel your own consciousness gently distangling itself from the others that so graciously couched it. Take a brief break and we shall continue. Anyway, while I was reading that, the thing that I got it was intuitively listening to that inner voice whenever you're talking to someone or you're reading something. Most of us think of it as a wandering mind or the chitter-chatter, like we're not paying attention. But if you can train yourself to recognize that what you're hearing psychically while you're also hearing what you're hearing physically, mentally, biologically, blah, blah, like everything Seth was saying there, you'll gain a more vast richness, a more vast paradigm. Things I always tell my clients, which I always then actually tell myself, is whatever advice you're feeling, you need to tell somebody that they need to get this or they need to understand this, and you feel really, the more you feel excited to do that, usually means that that message is for yourself or that message is for me. So whenever I want to tell somebody something really bad, I'm trying to step back and catch myself and say, well, what is that message for me? Still working on that one. Anyway, hope you enjoyed this, and I definitely recommend the Seth material. Sorry I have a little bit of a sore throat today, but these things happen. Bye.